Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kelsey Goforth and I'm DWDC's Director of Programs. Today I'm joined by my colleagues Amanda Coventry-Berridge and Melissa Mueller. Before we begin today, I want to acknowledge that while we are meeting virtually this afternoon, the land that Dying with Dignity Canada is on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, the Mississaugas of the Credit. We invite and encourage you to do your own research regarding the various treaties, in particular the land in which you're meeting on with us today. I'm so thrilled to welcome you to our second session of Your Healthcare Team, a series which aims to provide you with information on the roles and responsibilities of the care providers that make up your healthcare team. Today, our session will focus on death doulas and their role in your end-of-life care and how they support patients and their families. Before I welcome today's presenters, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items with you. Everyone on the call today is muted. However, there will be opportunities to submit your questions. To do so, please type your questions into the Q&A bar on the Zoom side panel, and we will read it out at the end. Please try to keep your questions as clear and concise as possible. That way we can get to as many of them as we can. While we are going to try to address as many questions as we can this afternoon, unfortunately, we may not get to everybody's. So if you do have an outstanding question by the end of the webinar today, you are welcome to email us at support@dyingwithdignity.ca, and we'll follow up with you individually. And the same can be said for any questions that you have that are quite personal in nature. Please do email us at support@dyingwithdignity.ca, and we'll try to get you the appropriate information. We will be sending a post-webinar survey today that's going to pop up on your screen after the webinar, and that will give you the opportunity to share your feedback with us. So we do encourage you to take a few minutes to fill that out if you can. This session will also be recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again later and share it with anybody who may have missed today's session. Now, to introduce today's speakers, we have Michele King with us today. She's an end-of-life doula and the founder of The Last Gift End-of-Life Doula Services in Rocky Mountain House, Alberta. Michele's passion for normalizing conversations around death and dying grew from experiencing the loss of her father at 9 years old, being diagnosed with a rare blood disorder at 21, and losing her mother from a stroke in 2018. Her ability to hold space and talk about hard topics has supported people and their families through serious illness, diagnosis, and at end of life. Her practice also incorporates the healing power of art and facilitates an 8-week expressive arts grief support program. And with us today, we have Mono Brown, PhD. Mono is a registered death doula with the End-of-Life Doula Association of Canada since 2020. As a queer and trans non-binary person, Dr. Brown advocates for and promotes self-advocacy among clients in medical and social contexts, such as hospitals and workplaces, where a lack of knowledge or respect may be negatively affecting their treatment and their care. Dr. Brown's practice is also supported by their expertise as an educator, health researcher, and writing consultant, all roles that have honed their knowledge of end-of-life issues and their ability to help individuals and groups navigate these issues skillfully and authentically. I will now pass it along to Amanda to get us started today.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Kelsey. I'm so excited to get started with the webinar today. Hello, everybody. I hope that you're just as excited as I am. Dr. Brown, Michele, thank you so much for sitting with us today. We really appreciate you being able to discuss the important roles that you serve as death doulas. So let's just get right into it, and we'll sort of alternate between speakers here as well. So maybe I'll start with Michele here. Michele, in your opinion, what is a death doula? How is it different from other doulas?
Well, the death doula role is, it's quite encompassing, but the basic definition of a death doula, also known as an end-of-life doula, it's known by different terms, is basically a person that provides non-medical holistic care. So spiritual support, emotional support, and physical comfort support to a person who has been diagnosed with a serious illness and to people at end of life. So that's kind of the basic definition, I would say, of an end of life doula.
Thank you. And Mona, was there anything you wanted to add on what Michele said?
I think I'd just echo Michelle's definition. I hear the term full spectrum used often for birth doulas, and I think there's a lot of overlap with end of life or death doulas. Some of us, in fact, have the pleasure of beginning these conversations with clients early, and we work often well after someone has passed away to support people with grief work as well. So maybe with just like a much longer process in which we might provide care and support.
Thank you. Actually, we'll start now with Mono, I guess. So we'll start with Mono. Why did you decide to become a death doula? What about this role interested you?
I'm sure that Michele can relate that I just have been someone who for much of my life has not really shied away from conversations about death. But I had to learn at a certain point that there was a time and place for such conversations, and that not everybody is open to having them, is as curious about end of life as I felt I've always been. I do want to acknowledge that, and I see it as associated with my identity as queer and trans, that I had lost a lot of people in my life by my 20s, and I think that also prompted my curiosity about death doula work. But ultimately what it came down to was learning about death doulas during my PhD in health humanities, and then finding out that we had a program here in Vancouver. And that really was the catalyst for me undergoing the training and striking up a practice just in the past few years.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing as well. It sounds like it was a very personal reason that you wanted to start this, and that you kind of always felt perhaps a bit of comfort about discussing these sort of hard topics, but also it sounds like it was a calling for you, especially related to your identity and those around you in your community. So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask Michele, how did you decide to become a death doula, and what about the role interested you?
Thank you. I've actually been sort of called to this work since about 2016, and it really came out of nowhere for me. I all of a sudden just felt I really wanted to be involved with hospice, and I wanted to sit with people who were dying. So I became involved in my local hospice, and in Alberta we have training that you have to take. So I took the hospice training that was offered here in 2016. And then I ended up moving to a smaller town that was just starting, Rocky Mountain House. They were just starting to develop their hospice. We didn't even have a bed here at the time. So I was a volunteer with them. But I also had taken expressive arts therapy training in 2014. And I've always been really called to using the arts. And I felt I use it a lot for my own healing. And so I started facilitating grief support groups just on my own, using an 8-week program that was developed through the senior clinical consultant at Comox Hospice out in BC. And so I've been facilitating that for a long time. And then while I was here in Rocky at one of our meetings, someone had mentioned the term death doula, and I had never heard that before, but it just stuck with me. And so really I became a death doula as a result of the experience from my mother having a stroke in 2018 and what I went through. Even though I had a lot of training in this world, I thought it really affected me. And then with the pandemic in 2020, I just said, I'm going to, take the death doula training. I need to do more work in this world. There just seemed to be a really big need for it. So I took the training through Douglas College in Vancouver, which is one of the one of the colleges that the End of Life Doula Association of Canada recognizes in order to become a member. And I wanted to be a member of that organization because they're advocating to get end of life doulas as part of palliative care teams across Canada. So.
Thank you so much for sharing, Michele. You know, just hearing from you, Michele, and hearing from you, Mono, it sounds like for both of you, this was a calling, but it was a calling because of the compassion that you hold for others, wanting to be able to reach out to others and connect with them and support them during difficult moments in their lives. And I think especially everybody can relate that it was a very difficult time when the pandemic first began. So I really have to applaud the both of you for taking on this calling. I know that it's certainly not for everybody, but it sounds like it really was an act of compassion and an act of connection for both of you. So I salute you for that. So our next question is something that Michele, you touched on a little bit. So maybe we'll start with you again, but if you could go into maybe just the basics of how did you become trained and certified as a death doula? I think a lot of people hear that term. Some people have been interested. In fact, I know some of our audience members have been interested in learning about it. So maybe just if you could tell us from your experience, how did you become trained? How did you get started?
I probably did a Google search to start with.
A good start.
Yeah, I don't know if I actually even knew of the school at the point that I wanted to take it, but it was the pandemic. So we couldn't meet in person. So I just started doing the research of what was available in Canada. And I think I must have come across the End of Life Doula Association of Canada first. And then I realized I wanted to be a member. So I needed to take the training from one of their recognized institutions. And so Douglas College was offering the online virtual version in September of 2020. And so it worked perfectly. So I signed up and took their course.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Mono, I wanted to ask the same thing of you. How did you get sort of started and trained and certified?
I'm fortunate to have been, I'm sure, one of the last in-person classes. I did take Brev 1100, which is the course that Michelle's talking about. It's offered through continuing education at Douglas College. They have a series of health certificates, I think. And I too had taken to Google to look for training because I knew about the death doula role, but not how someone could certify to become one. And I found Douglas College's course first, which seemed like such a welcome fit because I had just started teaching in college after finishing my PhD. And for me, I just felt like it was something I would do for myself. I have a non-teaching semester and I had the time to go up. I went up to Squamish and took the course in person at Quest University. It was really a beautiful experience to drive up there every day and to dedicate some of my own personal time to something that mattered to me so much. And then, of course, several months later, we were in lockdown and I was suddenly faced with having to earn some experience hours to register as a member of the End of Life Doula Association of Canada. And Michele, I'm envious of you for the training that you received in palliative before the pandemic, because as you can imagine, very difficult to gain that kind of hands-on experience. It has an impact on a doula's scope of practice, definitely, especially in terms of comfort care. So instead, I had to rely on my own sort of personal and professional network. I had friends and other contacts refer sort of voluntary clients for me. We did a lot of mainly grief work. I hosted end of life events. I had to kind of construct some volunteer experience over the course of 2020 so that I could register as a member. And then since then, I've been seeing clients.
Well, it sounds like you definitely made your own way, and it sounds like it worked because you definitely have clients. So good on you for improvising during a pandemic. I know a lot of people in pretty much everyone's profession had to try and improvise and adjust to the new normal. So it looks like it all worked out. Thank you so much for both of your answers. We're going to move on to some of the general questions about how to understand how a death doula works. So my first question, I'll pose that that to you, Mono. What does a typical day look like for you? What are the duties and responsibilities of a death doula?
Well, I suppose it's worth sharing that for me, it's really, I could talk to you about what a typical session looks like, maybe, or a typical kind of series of sessions looks like. Because I really want to emphasize that certainly in my case, death doulas are still, people are still just becoming aware of what kind of support we can offer. And so for me, my practice is kind of not something that I even dedicate every day of my work week to. I'm fortunate to be seeing clients regularly. So right now, what I'll typically do is I'll have a consultation with a client to really clarify what it is, what their goals are for our time together, what kind of support they're looking for, and whether it's a fit with my availability. And so if I'm dealing with a client or the loved one of a loved one, or sorry, just to clarify, I may be working with either a client who is facing a terminal diagnosis or is maybe approaching end of life or wants to prepare for end of life or work with grief, but I may also be supporting a loved one. A recent example is a client who just lost a parental figure. And it really depends on the situation, but typically we'll develop a series of sessions, most of which are virtual right now still, to address their issues, whether they're practical matters, like trying to prepare for the bureaucracy of end of life, or more emotional and spiritual care and support.
Thank you. And I think that's such an important distinction that you made, that it's not just about the individual that may be facing their end of life or is considering their end of life, but it can also be somebody that's mourning the death of somebody else, and not just a family member, but maybe it's their chosen family, or maybe it's a friend that they felt very close to and grieved to. So I think that can also sort of break the expectations of reaching out for support, that it doesn't have to be for you specifically, or it doesn't have to be specifically a close family member, but it can just be anybody that's undergoing that sort of the pain in that process, right? So thank you so much for that. I wanted to pass that question on as well to you, Michele, of what does a typical day look like for you? What are some of your duties and responsibilities?
Well, my first reaction is I don't think that there is a typical day in this work. And just, I guess, a couple different comments too on this. So it all depends on how you have your practice set up. Doulas don't all offer the same types of services. Everybody sort of goes where their heart is. And some doulas can offer advanced care planning, some don't. Some do sitting vigil, some don't. So every doula is quite different. And it also depends on what areas they work in. Like, do they volunteer in hospice, which I do that. And so that can be very irregular. They need somebody or they call somebody and you go. So you kind of have to have some flexibility if that's where you work, or do you run it like a typical business, which there are a lot of doulas that do it that way. There's a lot that offer services for free. Everybody is quite different in how they run their business. So typical depends on who you are. But if you run it like a business, it is very business-like. You have to market your business. You have to take consultation calls, talk to people, see if they're good fits. You need to set up your letters of agreement or your contract, however you do it. There's paperwork to be done, marketing activities. A big, big part of the doula world is networking. And like Mono was saying, that we're just starting to get known. It's a real grassroots sort of industry, if you want to call it that, where we have to get out there and we got to tell people, and we have to make ourselves known and do interviews like this and talk to our newspapers and go to our local events and connect with people. So that's a big part of it also.
Thank you so much. And I just want to press a little bit further. So let's say that you've already worked with a client, you've signed the agreement, and you're now sort of seeing them on a regular basis, if you will. What might a session look like with them?
If you were talking to me.
Yeah.
Again, that's all sort of set up in your initial consultations, like how do you want to work, right? Most doulas, I think, work on an hourly type of basis or a package basis, where you put together a package and you say, this is what I'm going to offer, so many 1 hour sessions, and we're going to get this completed. Or you just charge a package price of a number of hours that you're going to be with the client. And then each meeting it depends on where that person is. A big part of the doula work is we meet a person where they're at. We do not force an agenda. We don't force anything on the clients. We offer education and resources to them around any questions they may have, and we work with them with what they want to do, and we can make the suggestions. Usually it starts with, what is it that you feel you need to do? We kind of, what's left unfinished, where do we start? And then we can kind of go from there. But doulas have lots and lots of resources, and we also have networks of other doulas where we can go to. And in Canada, we have 2 fantastic organizations, the Death Doula Network of BC and the End of Life Doula Association of Canada, that we can access the membership and get more resources that way. So hopefully that answered your question a little bit.
Yes. Thank you so much. And I should have made sure to direct it to you, Michele, but thank you so much for answering. And then Mono, was there anything that you wanted to add?
I mean, I think, again, I'd echo Michele in that there's like a typical, going into a session, I think, I don't know if Michele agrees with this, but I'll try to have some aspect of end of life, I think, could be the focus for the session. And then there's a certain amount of just holding space for the emotions that come up in the context of confrontations and conversations about death, whether it's the potential or impending loss of a loved one, or someone trying to decide what it is that matters to them when facing death. And then, asking questions that will help people really identify for themselves what their wishes, their wants, or needs might be. And in a way, I like to think of it more as trying to just be just up ahead on the path, or even just behind, but kind of lighting the way a little bit. Like, I do try to take notes so that something that just seems like it needs to be the focus is something that we return to. Like, it might help to have an example, but I've worked with clients, for example, who are trying to prepare for end of life because they maybe have a partner with a terminal diagnosis or a series of conditions that might make it likelier that the partner will die sooner. And so trying to establish who will you call when you're at the hospital? Like, have you got that written down? And who would you not like to have present? Like, does that make sense, Michele? Like, practical questions that have emotional, spiritual, and even psychological implications. And especially important for people for whom their family of origin might not be the people that they wish to be included, or who prefer chosen family, or who are just trying to clarify. We're just living in a context, I think, where, in the past, as part of the taboo surrounding conversations about death, we've sort of tried to medicalize it. We've tried to really tie it to the status quo in certain ways, so that you didn't have to talk about death. It was just sort of like a protocol in place about who would be called, who would be allowed in the room. And I just think, and how we would then memorialize someone after they're gone. I think people are aware that the standard package maybe won't be a fit, but they aren't sure what to put in place instead. So we really have to be asking practical questions, but that may have bigger implications for people. I don't know if that helps at all.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you very much. I think something that I'd like to draw from as well from both of your answers is that it's very patient guided and very patient centered. I think a lot of people may have the conception about therapy that it's structured, that there's maybe a set of homework or a set of tasks for each hour, for each session, but I think, Michele, something that you articulated very well was that you treat the patient as they are that day or what they need that day, and I think that's quite beautiful to express as well, because when we talk about something like death and dying or end of life, it's hard to try and structure it so that, okay, on this day I'm going to talk about this aspect, and then next week we'll do this. It's an emotional, psychological, spiritual process, as you brought up as well, Mono. So thank you so much for that. That was great. I feel like that elaborates quite a bit on what your day looks like. So that was very helpful. I wanted to move to our next question, and Michele, we'll start with you this time. Do you know of any common misconceptions, or what are the most common misconceptions about death doulas and what they can offer?
Actually, this is a bit of a funny question in a way. The first thing I thought of with that question was most people I encounter have never heard of it before. So there's sort of really isn't one. If you say it, they're sort of in shock a little bit, like, what is a death doula? And then I explain it, and I will say that I don't think I've ever had any sort of a negative comment. People are usually like, oh my gosh, you do such fantastic work, or that's so needed. That's usually the response. But I have heard some common misconceptions where people think that you're there to make them die, or you're going to try to kill them or something. That's why you're there for some reason. Or also some of the misconceptions, I think, are that it's very depressing, sad, draining work. And that how could you do that type of work, type of thing. And I have never, ever thought that way myself. Like, the people that do this work, we are very called to this. We want to be there. We want to be with those people. So, of course, it can get emotional for us also. And we have to really work hard on grounding ourselves and taking care of our own selves in situations. So I think those are kind of all I've really heard.
Yes, thank you. And Mono, did you want to add anything to that, or any insights?
I really think it's a common misconception that death doula work is vigil work or by the bedside only. Actually, that's such a rare and small part of my practice. And I'm limited, of course, by the pandemic, so I think that may change things, but that's a huge misconception. But I agree also that there's this almost misconception in how many people respond so positively, like, wow, that's such an important role. And it seems so high-minded. And I almost think, hearing you talk about it, Michele, that it's maybe a bit of just another way that people kind of compartmentalize conversations about death or death work of any kind. They're like, oh, it's so important. But really, like, it's a lot of it is just going into thickets with people. And it can be, I would hesitate to say monotonous, because I don't find it monotonous at all, but it really is not high-minded work. Like, there are just a lot of practical ways that we can prepare for end of life. And death doulas, I think, just don't shy away from that. But then I just want to say that I have my own misconceptions. I think one of the hardest lessons I've learned is that I think I have more than once taken people at face value, or taken clients at face value, when they swear that death is not imminent. So I also have my own, maybe not exactly misconceptions, but misunderstandings to work through as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that ties in, and we have a question very similar to that. So we'll draw to that as well. But I want to start first with this question about how does a death doula work alongside a patient's healthcare team? So I think everybody thinks of their traditional sort of members of a healthcare team. So maybe your family doctor, or there's a specialist that you've been working with, or you have, a local nurse that might be supporting you. But what about a death doula? How does that work alongside a patient's healthcare team? And Mona, we'll start with you this time.
I think I can only really speak to my own experience, but to my knowledge in BC, like we aren't part of the palliative team, and we won't be until there's more recognition for ours as a profession. So I think that you don't really work alongside the healthcare team unless there's a very clear and written agreement in place for the ways that you will do so. We're not loved ones, we're not next of kin. And in my case, I don't have the kind of palliative or hospice training that Michele does. So I think we can become aware of the healthcare team and listen thoughtfully and encourage self-advocacy where possible, while helping our clients appreciate the kinds of decisions we can and cannot make on their behalf, and really trying to formalize any kind of hands-on support. But I think for the most part, it would still be, for me in my own practice, a case of trying to become cognizant of the members of the healthcare team, because I'm working outside of it, and just really follow along and be a supportive person as clients and their loved ones interact with and seek to have their needs met by the healthcare team.
Yes, thank you so much. And Michele, what's your experience? Because I know it seems to be very sort of individual to how each death doula practices. So in your experience, how do you work alongside a patient's healthcare team?
Well, again, unfortunately in Canada and Alberta, that I know for sure, we are not part of a regulatory body. So we get really shut down by the provincial health services. They don't really want anything to do with you because you don't really have a regulatory body. And so that is really why I wanted to be part of the End of Life Doula Association of Canada, because they are working on getting doulas to be part of this process. But I really believe that doulas can help healthcare teams. We can fill in gaps that healthcare providers can't. I have worked not in any sort of paid capacity, but I have supported social workers working with people who are dying. Not so much doctors. They don't really want to talk to you, in my experience. But because doulas seem to have more time to spend with people, sometimes they can notice things that other people don't. Any sort of changes in health, anything that we happen to notice that we can report to the healthcare team that might, maybe somebody's feeling depressed, or there's just these things that don't get noticed because they're not there long enough to see it. Some doulas are trained in facilitating conversations within families, which would really help healthcare providers. Having conversations is very difficult. A lot of healthcare providers are not trained in starting these deep conversations. A lot of doctors, they just don't want to do it. They want to avoid it. So a big part of the doula role is hopefully, while people are still healthy, is helping people start to get conversations started, to start thinking about their mortality, reflecting and figuring out what a person's values and beliefs are so that they can complete their advanced care documents and get them filled out ahead of time, and then go into their doctor and say, hey, I've got these documents, I want to talk to you about it. And the doctors can go, oh, good, I don't, have to have this hard conversation because somebody's already had it with them. They've already sort of started them talking along these lines. And hopefully they've all had conversations among family members. doulas advocate for people's last wishes. That's another part of our role. We're the ones that are there to make sure their wishes are carried out. We can support caregivers. We can do a lot of that stuff that kind of frees up healthcare workers from having to deal with that. And we also have a lot of resources that your typical healthcare workers may not have. We have so many resources. Like, I was blown away when I, spent all of my time studying the end of life world. Like, the stuff that we can provide people around comfort care, end of life planning, like it's amazing. Like, we really are a resource. And so hopefully we do become a real part of the palliative care team.
Thank you, Michelle. And I think I was definitely surprised when I first realized that that death doulas aren't as incorporated into a healthcare team as I think many patients would like, and as death doulas would like, because as you and Mono have articulated, there is a lot of support that you can provide, even just some of the techniques that you've already mentioned, including just being able to hold space and to talk about the discussions of death and dying with a patient at length that maybe a traditional healthcare provider simply can't afford. I think it really speaks to the importance of your role. And so I think I, along with the rest of the audience, do hope that as the profession continues to grow, that so too does a place grow for you in the team. And I think it was really important what you also mentioned about how you also serve as advocates for patients when at end of life, and for their specific wishes and for their values. So that's just sort of another champion, if you will, for patients. And I think everybody would agree that the more people you have on your side, whether you're healthy or you're at end of life, the better, right? So thank you so much, both of you, for your answers. So we're going to go into a topic a little bit more related now to MAID, medical assistance in dying. And Michelle, we'll start with you for this question, but we already touched on this a little bit, but can I ask, are death doulas only for those who are imminently dying or somebody who has a terminal illness?
Absolutely not. And I think as doulas, probably the majority of us would want to work with people while they're still healthy. When you get sick, and depending on the degree, there's a lot of, you don't have energy to do a lot of things. And so if you can start thinking about things way ahead, it will really help you, I think, when your end of life time comes. You can start to develop a relationship with your mortality, starting with your end of life documents. But there's a lot of deep work that can be done ahead of time. There's a lot of reflection processes, and there's just so many things that you can get in place to do that would really, really help yourself and your loved ones reduce stress if there was a diagnosis or an end of life. And but we work with everybody, really, healthy people through serious illness diagnosis and at end of life.
Thank you. And Mono?
Yeah, I thought of this as a common misconception that, we only work with imminently or actively dying clients, patients. But in fact, yeah, I agree. Like, it's such an exciting thing to be able to work with people who are just at various points in their life. Maybe my favorite is when somebody is just coming up on a life transition, like the transition of middle age or into older adulthood, and decides that as a gift to themselves or to their loved ones, they're going to begin to think about how they want the end to look. There's certainly a moving part of the training at Douglas College that some space was held for us as students to envision end of life for ourselves, because we too have to actually do the kind of planning and preparation that we support our clients in. I have a personal love of grief work, so I in fact deal with people who have experienced loss of any kind, work with and through grief in various ways. And I find that very meaningful work. It feels different from therapy or from traditional counseling because certainly when I work with clients who are in grief, I don't think that the goal is to spend several years or even a decade meeting on a weekly basis to explore underlying issues, but just to sort of unearth a loss that hasn't been attended to and to hold some space for it and to consider the ways that it's shaping a person's life. Maybe that is an important thing to emphasize in this session, that we're living until the very end, and then after we lose others. So the beauty of death doula work is the emphasis on thinking about how you want to live until you go. I think that's why the medicalization of death and dying kind of goes hand in hand with the taboo against talking about it, because if we don't really open up about death, explore it and explore our feelings about it and our thoughts, and consider what they mean for how we'll live until the very end, what's the best solution? It's just to use medical treatment to postpone death to the extent that that's possible. Maybe that's not necessary when we begin to think more seriously about what death really means to us. And so that's why I agree with you wholeheartedly, Michele. Like, we just really try to bring the resources and support to clients who are willing to consider end of life well before they enter into it.
Yes. Thank you so much for that, Mono. And I really loved the part where you're talking about some of the favorite parts of your practice is when you have a client that maybe isn't experiencing end of life, or is, approaching where you need to sort of think about that more imminently, but somebody that might just be going through a life transition. Because I think, as the name suggests, death doula, it sort of suggests that you need to sort of be close to that. But I love the idea that at the same time, somebody can come just as they're transitioning into a different stage of their life. And so I think that opens up the possibility of how you treat people. And something also to touch on as well is how you discuss the medicalization of death, and that it is just as important, obviously, to monitor our health and to access healthcare, but to also sort of do a little bit of introspective work as well, and talk about what's important to you, and talk not just about extending or maybe preventing death, but also about what's important in your life. So I think that was really beautifully articulated by you. So thank you. And I think it also touches in a little bit with the misconceptions we had before. So thank you. The next I want to ask is a bit more specific with MAID now. I want to ask you maybe first, Mono, have you ever provided services to somebody who is in the process of MAID? And if so, could you tell us a little bit more about that process and what happened?
Absolutely. When I started receiving calls from potential clients, what I'd share with my doula classmates was that I don't think I expected how much I'd hear from people who were grappling with MAID in some way, whether because they were wondering about it for themselves or about a loved one's curiosity about or intention to pursue medical assistance in dying. And some of my colleagues would respond and say, like, oh, why? Because it's intense and difficult. And I said, no, it just is. It's just the reality, I think, of the moment that we're living in. So I have worked with clients. Again, this is a situation where it's mainly sort of clients in middle age who are supporting aging parents. And I've had clients who have lost parents, or who have had parents who chose MAID. And so what that was like, well, it was really an exciting gift, because a doula is one who opens up conversations about end of life and seeks to involve the family. And that was the real gift. Like, when I think about some MAID experience that I've heard about when people about my age have lost parents, I think that what I felt was that advantageous about being a doula in that context was really being able to have frank and timely conversations with the entire family about everything from what they wanted to do together before MAID to what plans need to be put into place, for example, to secure employment leave and to make travel arrangements in a pandemic. And it was just such a gift for then to hear as a doula while supporting a client with grief in the aftermath of MAID, to hear also about the very good days leading up to it, because some of those plans were already in place. And it just felt, I really felt that my clients could be there and be very present and be in the moment because someone had helped them get ready. I mean, I certainly hope that that's what my role was.
I think so. I think so for sure. And I think that ties in as well also to the role that you already mentioned about being able to work out all of the logistics, all of the things that people don't want to focus on when all they want to focus on is their loved one. So thank you for that. And Michele, I wanted to ask the same thing of you as well. Have you ever supported somebody that was undergoing the process or thinking about the process for MAID, and what happened?
No, I haven't actually supported anybody, but I do offer it as part of my services. I know a lot of doulas don't. Everybody's very personal when it comes to what they offer, but I do know of doulas here in Alberta who actually some of them sort of call it maybe their specialty, that they support people going through MAID. And I've heard actually some beautiful stories of sort of people supporting people who are going to go through MAID, and some of the ceremonies and the rituals that they went through before it happened. And yeah, it can be a beautiful process, but I haven't personally.
That's okay. Thank you for sharing. I wanted to ask maybe then as a follow-up for you, you mentioned that some death doulas don't like to offer that service or choose not to. Maybe then we'll flip it and say, why would you choose, or why did you choose that you would like to support anybody that is going to go through with MAID or is thinking about MAID?
I think it's all based on our personal beliefs, and if whether you do or you don't. And I think from doing the deep work that we do as doulas, and depending maybe on how far you've gone with things, myself personally, it's around my beliefs, and I would definitely have no trouble supporting anybody going through the process.
Thank you. I'm sure your clients will be delighted to hear that if there ever ends up being a client that wants to undergo MAID, that they can have that support from you as well. All right, so thank you both for that. I want to move to a question about dying specifically, and I'll start with you, Michele, for this one. But how do you comfort or support someone who's deeply afraid of dying or can't stop thinking about their death?
It's very common having fears around death and dying. We probably all do. You ask people, they've even ranked what the #1 fear is around death and dying. And I think what happens is if we can actually name our fear, what specifically our fear or our fears are, then we can begin a conversation. We can start an exploration around that fear, because most of our fears, we don't have enough education around. Do we have a fear of pain at end of life? Is it a fear of not having enough oxygen? And then we can begin to address those fears. And I truly believe knowledge is power. I've done this work myself around my own fears, and it has helped me immensely when I've gotten educated around what the options are to reduce pain. When it comes to oxygen, how does that all work when it comes to end of life? And I really think knowledge is power. And when we can start to educate ourselves and start to begin to understand what our options are, how it's going to affect us, developing a relationship with our mortality, that we can really, really reduce those fears once we have reassurance.
Yes, absolutely. And I love how you make that connection of how we can lessen our fears with knowledge and with education. I think that was beautifully put. And Mono, I wanted to ask the same thing of you. You know, what have you done in the past when somebody's been deeply afraid of dying or cannot stop thinking about it?
I really don't know if it's my website or something, but I do attract a lot of loved ones who want support so that they can show up for a dying person in their lives, or even in some cases, I've worked with clients with dying pets. And I agree with you, Michele, wholeheartedly. Death is a physiological process. There are visible signs of death and dying. There are even some really fascinating aspects of end of life that we learned about in Bravo 1100, including about things like vision-like experiences. And so really inviting people to recognize that is, for the most part, a process that we are equipped for, and to consider their experiences or encounters with a dying loved one, maybe more in physiological terms, so that they're reassured that it was a process that even with some of the pain and suffering, that those are just parts of this bigger process through which we all transition at some point. And I think it is helpful to work with people right away to be able to talk about what they've seen, what they've heard, how it felt for them, what kind of fears it brought up in them and feelings. That there is an opportunity to assuage death anxiety. My sense is that that's part of grieving, to be able to actually just describe a death in very frank terms, if you've been the one to bear witness to it, so that other people can help you carry it. Because what I have seen is that people who have had kind of unprocessed encounters with death and dying tend to develop death anxiety because there's been little opportunity to make sense of what they've witnessed. And then it can come up at really inopportune moments. Like you have a child and all of a sudden you're terrified for your child's life. I worked with a client in this case who had not processed an encounter with death because it was a near-death experience. He had almost lost his father to a really brutal car accident. And so had this really frank encounter with near death that later on in life created this death anxiety that had a lot to do with unprocessed grief. Mm-hmm. So that's a part of it, is just allowing people the time and space to describe in frank and sometimes explicit detail what they've witnessed, and then offering them sources of knowledge or wisdom, let's say, to help them make sense of it in ways that help them feel better, less anxious, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. This next question is a bit of a flip, if you will. So we have somebody who can't stop thinking about it, or is deeply afraid of it. But what about a patient whose family or a patient themselves that doesn't want to discuss death or end of life choices? Maybe they're in denial. How would you support somebody like that? And Mono, we'll start with you.
I feel like I have this problem. So, I mean, it's why we have to become very clear about what death means to us and how we'd like it to go. So, you know, I think it's easy to become preoccupied with a family who's recalcitrant, resistant, determined not to have the conversation, but it can be had somewhere. And I think it begins from that place of trying to identify like what death means to me and how I'd like it to go. And while I don't endorse compromises, I think it is helpful to establish some boundaries at end of life and decide where am I willing to allow my loved ones, or even if it's my family of origin, to handle death in the ways that they need to. An example might be, okay, I'm not religious, and I'm certainly not hoping to have a religious burial as a queer and trans person. However, if I know that my own wishes will be enacted, am I willing to allow the people in my life who want to have a religious service that freedom to do so? I have to be clear about what matters to me and aware of where I'm willing to make compromise. And so that's how I work with clients as well.
Thank you for that. And Michele, the same question to you. How do you help a patient that doesn't want to discuss death, or a patient whose family doesn't want to discuss death?
Yeah, unfortunately, sometimes that happens. We're hired, usually a doula is hired by a patient. It could be a family, but we are there for the patient. We are there to advocate for the patient. There's a lot of people that hire doulas because they want to make sure that their wishes are followed and that it's not somebody else that's going to take control. And so, we're there to work with the patient, find out what their wishes are, and to make sure those wishes are followed through with. And, unfortunately, we can try to have the conversation with our family or our loved ones about all the things about end of life. But if nobody's willing to talk, sometimes that just happens, unfortunately, and we just have to, I guess, be okay with that and know that at least we tried to talk. There are some doulas that are really skilled in conversations with families around this, if they're willing to come to the table and talk. Sometimes if you can even just get one person, one ally that would be with you or to talk with you about this, sometimes they can move family members to begin conversations. But if that doesn't happen, then, your wishes are your wishes and they should be followed. And that's what doulas are there to help with.
Thank you so much from the both of you. And I think you've spoken to it quite well, that ultimately it's about the patient and the focus is on the patient. And Mono, I think you expressed that being able to set boundaries about your end of life wishes is important. And then Michele, how you articulate as well, that sometimes it can just be one ally that you can sort of bring to your side or have on your side to sort of break these difficult conversations, but that sometimes there's no compromise, or there's no pursuit that can be made, and that ultimately it still has to be about the patient, about their wishes. So I think that's really important to zero in with when it comes to maybe family members that are also still, unfortunately, in denial. So thank you. We have just a couple more questions here. I think the hour has flown by for me. I'm sure for you too as well. So I have a bit of specific questions. And so Mono, we'll start with you. So you mentioned in your bio and that in your practice that you have experience with patients that identify as 2S LGBTQ. And so I wanted to ask, what are, if any, some of the challenges or differences that a patient might experience when accessing their end-of-life care? And I know you could probably teach a whole semester on that subject, but maybe just some of the things that come up to mind immediately when the question's asked.
I think even at a time when, thanks to Bill C-16, there's been a real move to increase gender competency within healthcare, that most legal and healthcare systems and settings are designed to support the status quo. And that's not just in terms of sexuality or sexual orientation and gender, but it's true of like race, ethnicity, ability. And so I think that many members of queer and trans communities, I think, kind of on one hand, have had to do this work on behalf of one another, like on behalf of our loved ones, our chosen family, for many decades now, maybe to the point of burnout. And now I think a lot of queer and trans older adults are really depending on a broader, more broad-based support within end of life. for the sake of their dignity and also their safety. You know, many people fear dying alone, understandably, or are afraid of dying in hospital, or fear the pain and suffering of end of life. For queer and trans adults, I think many also fear the loss of their identity in that final chapter, and so they're really depending on we're really depending on healthcare systems to change to increase our visibility, I think, so that we can feel seen and heard and understood and safe and supported at a very difficult time. I know from my own experience offering these services professionally that while queer and trans people have done ostensible death doula work for many decades now, most are financially limited in their ability to access the extra care that they genuinely need to navigate end of life safely. And so that's a big issue as well. Like I don't get to see enough members of my community as clients, even though I'm willing to do this work on a sliding scale or pro bono. So that's something that I need to reconsider at this point. And I've also had to look for other opportunities, like for example, advocating for queer and trans older adults in different settings to raise awareness about the serious existential dilemma they face when trying to access care in their life. Anyway, I'm not sure that that's very coherent, but I'd invite people in the audience to reach out to me directly if you have thoughts about this issue.
Thank you. No, that was really good. And I think what it sounds like you're describing here is what they need is encirclement from the healthcare system. They need the exact same support that a patient from maybe a cisgender identity or from the traditional binary identities receive. What they need is exactly what everybody else needs, and because of discrimination or prejudice, they don't. And so it sounds like what they need now is broad societal support. So I think you articulated that perfectly. So thank you. So Michele, I wanted to ask a little bit about your practice at The Last Gift. It also includes an expressive arts grief support program, and you also talked a little bit about how you even did that before your work as a death doula. But I wanted to ask if you could speak a little bit more about the role of art in the grieving process, or if you could share a story of a time where you feel art really helped a client.
I've always felt art was really important. I took some training in 2013 by a woman who used art in a life coaching way, where you did creative exercises, and it was amazing work. And then I wanted to take the work further into the expressive arts. And now expressive arts, a lot of people don't know, they are traditionally considered art making, drama, creative writing, music, dance, and movement. So it's very somatic. It's very in your body. There's movement. And we are in such amazing times right now because of the research being done around trauma and art being involved in this. And what they've found is that grief sits like trauma in the body. And grief cannot be, or trauma can't be processed by thinking about it or talking about it. It's not in this right part of the brain. It's in the part of the brain where we need to experience it in our body. We need to move it through our body. So using the arts to process grief is amazing. And I've facilitated the program many times in the last couple of years. And usually we get to the 8th week and nobody wants it to end. They want to keep connecting. They want to keep meeting. They've made this specific time every week their sacred space that they've dedicated to come together to work on themselves. And it's amazing work. And you're going to start seeing it very mainstream. But I mean, the use of art is already in hospitals, music, journaling, writing, all of that stuff. So, mankind used art for thousands of years to heal themselves. The Greeks wrote the tragedies, the plays, they drew on the cave walls. We need to express ourselves as our innate part of who we are. So yeah, I've just seen it many times. People love the process, and they get there's healing on many different levels about when you connect in a group, people are seen and heard. They develop a network, a support group of these small group of people who know their story. And then they're able to tell their story week after week in a different way, using the arts, where they do not need to share with people, but they have gone through the process. And they make new meaning every week. So yeah, it's beautiful using the arts.
Thank you. And I love that way that you articulated about how trauma has to be externalized, and how you use a physical act to externalize, and that it's not really able to be appeased if you're just thinking about it. So I think that was beautiful the way you worded it. Well, thank you both so much for that. That concludes the formal part of the interview. So we have a little bit of audience Q&A now. So we're going to pull some questions from our audience. Thank you so much to everybody who submitted their questions. Let's start with perhaps let's start with a good question here. What are the differences between a death doula and a grief counselor, or perhaps a death doula and a social worker? Mono, did you want to start and tackle that?
I like, sure, I'd be happy to. And I like this phrase that Michele used in the session, filling the gaps. I think that those are very clearly delineated professions. In fact, bereavement counselor is something that came up for me when I did a personality test. I did the Myers-Briggs with a class in 2019, and it was then that I got the result that I should be a bereavement counselor. But I wouldn't go back to school. So I became a death doula. I think that death doulas, right now we have the professional freedom and capacity to fill gaps. And so there may be ways that we can adapt that people who are working in more traditional or conventional professions are unable to. So whenever there's a need, I think for death doulas, it's because there are gaps in care.
Absolutely. And Michele, did you have anything to add to that?
The first thing that just comes to my mind is it's the training. Like, a death doula is not a grief counselor. We're not, well, some of us aren't, but the training is just not the same. We're not therapists or counselors. We're there to listen. We're that compassionate, calm presence, which counselors do that too. But we let people, come to their own meaning making, and we're not diagnosing, and we're not pushing anything, an agenda or anything. It is just they're different roles.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you for both of that as well. We've got another audience question here, and this can you guys can choose who wants to go first in this case. Our audience asks, what experience or volunteer work would you suggest before beginning the training to become a death doula? For example, Michele, you already had some experience working in a hospice.
Mm-hmm. So what is recommended a lot of the time is to go and volunteer at your local hospice, and try and get in there, because then you get to be around that atmosphere, and you can see before you put the money out to take any sort of training, whether that is truly what you want to do, and maybe spend some significant time in that atmosphere. And then if your heart feels really, really called to be of service to people on a deeper level, then I would recommend to go take the training. And then again, depending on where you live, if you live in Canada and you want to be part of the End of Life Doula Association of Canada, who's advocating for doulas in palliative care and to be part of the healthcare team, you might want to be part of their association. So then you want to go to the school that they recommend in order to be registered there.
Thank you, Michele. And Mono, any suggestions?
that seems to me like an excellent course of action for an aspiring death doula. Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, we're almost out of time here, so we're going to try and squeeze in one more. And we didn't get to elaborate on this as much during the interview, so I wanted to ask, and maybe Mona, you can start this time. I believe one of you had mentioned vigil sitting, and our audience wants to know, what does that look like? What does that entail?
Michelle, do you want to take this? Because I seldom, if ever, get to vigil.
Oh, okay.
I don't know that people really, I don't know. People go to my website. Maybe I'm not the person they want by the bedside, but.
No.
Yeah, sure. I can take this one. So a lot of doulas, well, I don't know how many, but some doulas sit vigil and some doulas don't. So sitting vigil is when death is imminent, when you're within those last hours. Now, we can never say what the exact time is going to be, but we can get a good idea by the signs at end of life. And basically, we are just making sure that person's not alone. Family will be there. People take their turns sitting with the person for a number of hours. Doulas that don't sit vigil, a lot of them will make suggestions to family and loved ones about what they can do during that time, because it can go on for days, because we never really know when that person is going to die. So it can be a really, really long, tiring process for family members, and depending on how many people are around. So it's really those last hours or days before death, and you're just sitting by the bedside, and you're creating sacred space, hopefully, at end of life, and just spending your last hours with that person.
Thank you. All right. So unfortunately, we are almost out of time here. So I just wanted to thank you, Mono and Michelle, so much for sitting down with us and for sharing your experiences, your insights, your knowledge. I know that I certainly found this very helpful, and I know for sure that our audience found this very helpful. We actually already pulled some comments so far from our audience. So I have one here. As a hospital social worker, I have gotten so many questions answered through this. Thank you. So that's one of them. And then we have another here. Thank you to Mono and Michelle for the highly valuable information. So just know that you've made a difference with this today. So thank you so much for sitting down with us. And thank you to our audience for sitting with us today, for giving us your questions. And just to remember, of course, that this session is recorded. So if you want to be able to watch this again, or watch it with a loved one, or if you had to miss it or miss parts of it, we do have it recorded. So thank you, everybody, today. Please make sure that you fill out the post-webinar survey that will pop up in just after we conclude. And so thank you again to Michelle and Mono, and thank you to our audience, and everybody have a good day. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank